I just want to do God's will.
The kind of revolution that the world needs is a Christian revolution.
If you want a miracle, you've got to expect it to happen.
You're the recipients of God's grace and God's blessings, and you rejoice in that reality.
Welcome to Life Today Live. If you watched it all, you know that Life Outreach International, we partner with a lot of great organizations, and we do a lot of work around the world. And there's some things going on that I want to bring your attention to because I believe as believers, we should be concerned about what goes on outside of our borders. And I know it's easy to get caught up with what's going on in our own country, and we need to pay attention to that. We need to have influence there, but we can do a lot around the world. I want to show you an article that came out August 20th, last week, in Newsweek. And you can see the headline there. It says 70,000 Christians have been killed in Nigeria this year. And if you read down into the article, you see that that's more than the rest of the world combined as far as we know. What is going on there? What is going on in other areas? What are Christians doing about it through organizations like Life Outreach International, as well as a group called Open Doors, and you'll hear more about them celebrating their 70th anniversary. I've got the CEO of Open Doors, Ryan Brown, back with me to talk about Nigeria and to talk about some other issues that are impacting our brothers and sisters around the world. Ryan, welcome back to Life Today Live. Good to see you.
Randy, so good to be with you again today.
So, opening up with Nigeria, it's natural that we don't necessarily think about every place around the world, right? Especially when in the news it's Israel and Gaza and, things like that. What do you see going on over there, and why is it happening?
Yeah, so there has been a wave of violence throughout sub-Saharan Africa that has been rising, that is mounted and directed towards Christians. And Nigeria is really what I would characterize as kind of the epicenter of what we see there. For the last several years, you just mentioned the reality that more people have been killed because of their faith in Jesus in Nigeria over recent years than all other places in the world combined. And so, Nigeria, again, is really, in some ways, you can kind of think of it as the tip of the spear of this macro trend that we're continuing to see. And this is a trend where the church, the people of God are coming under fire. One of the things that has made interesting, or has made Nigeria specifically so interesting, is it has been there have been realities on the ground there that have been unfortunately mischaracterized by broader media. That there is a reality that the persecution of Christians never exists in a vacuum. There are so many things like economic realities that get interwoven in there and can shape the complexion of what persecution looks like. But what has happened in northern Nigeria specifically is that there are Fulani militants, and these are Islamic extremists that are largely pastoralists. So they raise livestock and largely nomadic in that. And the Christian populations historically have been farming populations. And so, the Fulani militants have looked to drive the Christians out of their land. And, there is a religious motivation. Here recently, in one evening, there were about 200 Nigerian Christians that were killed. And there were all sorts of religious proclamations that were being shouted by those that were perpetuating this violence. This is, individuals were killed by gun, by machete, were locked into buildings that were lit on fire. This was men, women, and children. And what has happened is that there are many folks in the media that have mischaracterized this as an issue of conflicts arising from climate change, that as these pastoralists have had difficulty in finding grazing land, that has been the source of the conflict. That has been a factor, but that has not been the sole motivation. And to mischaracterize it as that is really an incomplete picture that's being painted.
It's okay. It's interesting you bring that up, because when we were in South Sudan, Of course, Sudan has, a very Muslim influence, militaristic Muslim influence. Of course, they had that civil war there. In South Sudan, you have a lot more Christians, and then you have a lot more what they call animists, which are just kind of local tribe. It's more superstition than anything.
Yeah.
And we're in fact, in one of our clinics one day, they brought an ambulance showed up, and I was like, "What's going on here?" And they brought in these guys that had been shot. Into the clinic where they're trying to help children who are malnourished, and these guys that are being shot showed up because it was the only clinic for like hours away. And there is the reality that they do fight over water. They do fight over grazing land, especially with the nomadic herdsmen. And so, and there's the tribal issues. When they were evacuating United Nations personnel out of Juba in South Sudan while we were there, and I was asking around the UN compound where I was at, and they're like, "No, you're in Dinka land. You're safe." I'm like, okay. I'm trying to understand all these tribal, long-standing conflicts and fights and that kind of thing. So you have a lot of factors, and I think it is fair to go, okay, how much are these Christians sort of cultural Christians in the sense that they just identify that, and it's not really a religious war? But then when you get into some of the rhetoric, what you're talking about with the Muslims, I mean, it is part of their religion, which makes it a part of their life and everything they do, that there is this religious element to it. And it can be hard and to know what's the primary motivation, or is it a secondary motivation? How do we take it when we see these reports like this? Because it can be confusing to people who just don't know. And even those of us who, I mean, I've experienced some of it myself, and I still kind of go, well, what's really going on here? How do we know that this is a plot to kill Christians?
Yeah, it can be difficult at times to fully separate those, especially in areas where there are, concentrated populations of Christians,
Yeah.
because, when that entire population is being hit, well, is that just because of the geography they were happen to
Right.
be occupying,
Right.
or is it because of the religion? There are other places. There were some recent attacks in the DRC, and there
Always.
were a number of folks that were killed there. And you see, and these are communities where you have Christians and Muslims that are together side by side, and you see, okay, the church destroyed, the mosque untouched, these 40 Christian homes destroyed, these Muslim homes untouched. Layer upon that, some of the religiously motivated, dialogue and shouts that are
Right.
being
Right.
shouted as these things are being done, and it's pretty quick to see that, well, yes, the faith is certainly um, a factor in there, and it becomes incredibly difficult too in certain areas where, again, this is largely the Islamic extremists, and because in some of these cases, these extremists, they will attack both Christians and even some moderate Muslims, and
Yeah.
so it's
Yeah.
it can be incredibly difficult to navigate through all the nuances there, but that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to do that. We do
Yeah.
need to dive in and to understand what is truly going on.
Yeah. In fact, I saw in Nigeria a mosque was recently attacked, and you go, "What's going on there? Are the Christians fighting back?" I mean, because, but yeah, like you say, there are so many nuances to this, and I don't want to claim something that's not true, but at the same time, we can't ignore Christians who are being persecuted. I don't know. What does the average person do? The person watching this, listening, going, "Well, that's terrible, but I don't know what to do about it." What can they do?
Yeah. I think there's two things, and I'm going to start with the more important one. When we come alongside our brothers and sisters in these areas, and we ask, how do we help? We never want to be an organization that comes in and just assumes or imposes what we, think that, the church there on the ground needs. And so we ask, what does the church need? And first and foremost, that the thing that they ask for is prayer. That they want to know that they are not alone. I think one of the so many of the Christians in these areas, they expect persecution.
Hmm.
And the Bible tells us to expect persecution. That this is a reality. They're not trying to see that persecution eradicated, but what they're asking for is through these prayers is that they will know that they are not alone, that they are not
Yeah.
isolated within that persecution. And so prayer is an incredible, incredible thing. As we come alongside, and I can't tell you the encouragement that I've seen, some of these individuals express as they have heard that people around, their brothers and sisters around the globe are lifting them up in prayer.
Yeah.
That has been an incredible encouragement to them.
It's true.
There are also situations, though, where in many of these cases, you take a look at the laws on the books, and the rights of Christians legally are supposed to be protected. They
Mm.
should be
Mm.
protected. But in many cases, and we see this in Nigeria certainly, where there has been perhaps an unwillingness or an inability to enforce the rule of law in ways that would protect Christians. And those that seek to strike out against Christians are often able to do so with impunity.
Right.
And so, there are opportunities where we can come together as a global body of Christ and in solidarity raise a voice to places like the UN, places like Parliament, to our own State Department,
Yep.
and places like that that can say all we're asking for is that these laws that have written that they're saying are on the books that are true in these places, that those be upheld, that that there be accountability for those that would seek to violate those laws. There are times and places where there can also be issues of justice that we can help influence and advocate on behalf of our brothers and sisters.
Yeah, and with Boko Haram in Nigeria, you don't have a government favorable towards Christians, and I don't want to. I absolutely pray. I think we underestimate the power of prayer, but I also think that that's one of two things: we pray and we act. And
Yes.
and whether it's calling your congressman, if they get one message, once every 6 months about Nigerian Christians, they probably won't. But if we start hitting them over and over again, they're going to be like, hey, what's going on here? Maybe we should raise some kind of flag about this. And the pressure of the United States on a country like Nigeria has great power. And we do have a president right now who will wield that power in a positive way. So I would encourage people, if God puts it on your heart for Nigeria or any other country where there's being, persecution is going on, to reach out to your local, your state, your rep in, I'm sorry, the House of representative, and your senators, if I can spit that
Yeah.
out. But you can go on websites and find out who they are, find out how to contact them, send a very nice note, but then do it again and again, and call other people and say, let's hit them with this over and over, and they'll start. You'll get their attention, and that's the start of something. The other thing I would say is to support organizations like you guys. We don't work in Nigeria directly, but you guys are working in a lot of areas where the persecution is the issue. Tell me about your 70th anniversary and what you guys are doing, because I think this is critical. This is our mission here on Earth, man. You guys are doing it.
Yeah. Well, and as part of our 70th, one of the things that we are focusing on this year is, in response to what's going on in Nigeria and throughout really the continent of Africa, um, and is an initiative called Arise Africa. And this is an initiative that pastors there on the ground, this was their idea, that they came to us and said,
Hmm.
hey, can you help, raise this awareness? And it becomes an easy way for us here, again, this is half a world away from many of us. I mean, many of us, if asked to point to it on a map, would have a difficult time doing that. It can feel very far and removed, but this Arise Africa initiative is an easy way to do all of those things that you just talked about. That, one, as people sign up on that, we will send out prayer items that are specific to the situations on the ground there. We are looking to collect 1 million signatures on this Arise Africa petition that will be taken to the UN, that will be taken to Parliament, that will be taken to the State Department to say, hey, these issues are important. and we stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters. And then lastly, I mean, that there are opportunities that people can give alongside. Right now, in this community area in Benue State, in Ni northern Nigeria, where, again, there have been multiple killings, but again, the climax was over 200 in one evening.
Mm.
And again, it was pretty horrific the way that that was carried out. But because of that, families have had to flee. And there are right now about 9,000 folks that have been displaced from this community,
Yeah.
9,000 Christians that we're coming alongside and supporting with food aid and shelter and those types of things. So, those, through Arise Africa, that's a way in which people can do it. But, that is, again, 70 years, as you mentioned. Brother Andrew, many of, viewers and listeners have familiarity with the story of Brother Andrew that was, brought to popular attention through the book God Smuggler
Hmm.
years ago,
Hmm.
as he detailing his work as he smuggled Bibles behind the Iron Curtain. But it was 70 years ago this year that Brother Andrew made his first trip behind the Iron Curtain
Wow.
in Poland and met the church members there and realized that there were entire congregations that didn't have access to the written Word of God and began his efforts of bringing Bibles, smuggling those across borders. He had through suitcases. He eventually had a blue VW Bug that was retrofitted with hidden panels and all those things to get the Word of God to the people that needed it.
And the thing about that is that this is the tradition of Christianity, because you go all the way back to where Jesus was. I forget where he was going, but the disciples were like, Jesus, don't go there because they want to kill you. And Jesus said, yeah, I'm going. And that's where Thomas, that we call him Doubting Thomas. He's also the Thomas who said, well, then we'll go with you so that we may die with you.
Yeah.
And so this is Christianity. It's going to the places where we're hated, where the gospel is not always received, but it's where it's needed, and it's where we can have a great impact. And this is, I hate to use the word tradition, but it is. This is a tradition of going in, and also what you're talking about, meeting the needs of people. So I love that. I want to show people your website real quick. That Arise Africa initiative. It's at opendoors.us. And you can join that. You can start with the prayer, but let's end with some action. Let's meet the needs, and you can be a part of something that really does make an impact. And let me show you the website real quick. And let's see. It's rolling over there. There's the Stand Up for Christians in Africa banner right there. So you'll know you're in the right place when you see that. And that's what we need to do. And one thing I want to ask you about, because I've experienced this, and it is humbling, I think is the right word. And you touched on it a little bit, but that's the faith of the people in these areas where, being a Christian in the United States, you might get somebody say something negative about you and think, oh, I'm being, persecuted. No, you're not. These people that face death for their decision to follow Christ, it's, it's a perspective changing thing, I think, when you meet these people. What's it done for you to know some of these people in these areas where they are persecuted just for believing in Christ?
Yeah, I think humbling it is the right word to utilize, the one that you utilized. And it's so interesting because we hear these stories and our first assumption is, gosh, the church there, they need us. And that is true.
Yeah,
They
they do.
do need
Yeah,
us.
they do.
But there are elements that I think we need the church there as
That's true.
well.
That's so true.
There was a gentleman that I met not long ago from Sudan, and you were recently in South Sudan,
Hmm.
and how war has just traumatized the country there. But this gentleman, he had grown up as a Muslim and came to Christ, and that there's a whole different level of persecution for those that um, change
Yeah.
their faith, that
Hmm.
come to Christ. And so he was experiencing that. He'd been rejected by his family, but he was continuing to evangelize to his local community, and he was thrown in prison. And this prison, I mean, at times he was in a cell that it wasn't even big enough to lay down in. There were times where the lights were out, and I I specifically asked him about, okay, it says, Jesus said, "Blessed are the persecuted." You know, talk to me about that. And he said that, yes, absolutely is the case. He said his words actually rocked me. He said, in terms of my faith, he said, I went into to prison as a kitten, but I came out as a lion
Mm,
because as I was in prison, I experienced the person of Jesus Christ in ways that I had not up to that point in time. This is a man that was, in prison for his faith. He was a follower of Christ. He knew Christ. He said, but in the darkness of that prison cell, I saw the light of Christ in a whole new way. This is a gentleman that, you know, so often we talk about scriptures like, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And for us, that's a metaphor.
mhm.
For individuals like this is a real thing.
Yeah.
And, he said that, that the presence of Christ was with him and it changed him. And those are lessons that I think that we need to learn. I mean, for us, it may not be the darkness of a prison cell, but it could be the darkness of a diagnosis that the doctor has given that we weren't expecting or you didn't want. It could be a broken relationship that we're walking through. That there can be all sorts of ways that the enemy can look to invite darkness into our stories. But as our brothers and sisters model for us, time and time again, even in those dark moments, Christ is there. And Christ has a redemptive purpose that he can work through these things. And so, that's the thing that I've learned that, we have something to learn from our brothers and
Yeah,
sisters.
we
And
do.
what they are teaching us is that Christ is present in our stories, even if we don't see him, even if we're not feeling him in the ways that we feel like we should be or we wanting to experience him. He is there and he is working. He is still sovereign. His promises are still true. And he is working a redemptive purpose, and we can have a faith that says that, like Romans 8:28 tells us, that all of these things, whether we understand them or not, they are working together towards a good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose.
Yeah, man. I was in a hut of a woman who had several children, and she had to walk, a couple miles to get water, and it was not clean drinking water for her family. And you do that every day, and there's dangers inherent just in that, not just for people, but from wildlife. And of course, you got the disease. And I asked her, how do you, she was a Christian, and so I asked her if she prayed, and she's like, oh yes. And I said, what do you pray? How do you pray? At night when you go to bed. And I was sitting on her bed because the hut was, was small, like a small office
Yeah.
or something. And she said, she started listing the things that she was thankful for. She had a husband, her children, the fact they could go to the forest and collect some food from time to time, something to eat, all these things that she was grateful for. And then she said, I just asked that we would get, that the water wouldn't make our children sick. And she had lost a child with the water there. And I looked around at our crew, and they were feeling the same thing I was, which was this woman, they have nothing. I mean, it's a day-to-day existence. It's so far from where we live that it's sometimes just hard to relate to, but yet there's a spiritual depth there and a gratefulness there that you don't see necessarily, here in the affluent West. And that reminder that, God is working in ways that are eternal, that we don't always see. And when we join with those who are suffering, whether it's persecution or whether it's just for lack of food, lack of water, lack of shelter, when we join with them, we are joining with them in an eternal sense and at a depth that is spiritual. It's not just, it's a nice thing to help somebody who has a need. It is. But there's something deeper going on. And that's why I love it when I can talk to somebody who has experienced that with believers around the world, to understand really the nature of things from the way God sees it, not just the way we see it in our day-to-day lives. And that's why I appreciate you doing the work that you do. How do you pray not just for those people who are in desperate need, but for the church here that needs them in the way that you say they are. How do we connect?
Yeah, it is. We talk all the time that, the work that we do isn't about charity, it's about kinship. It's
Mm,
about, bringing the people of God and the church of God together. And I do think, to your point, this idea of comfort that, I've become convinced that the enemy has two primary tools in his toolbox to attack the church. And one is that idea of persecution, trying to, break the back of the church through
yeah.
fear or intimidation. But I think the other is this comfort,
Mm,
that we're lavished in our comforts to the point that we just become so blind to the things of God around us. Jesus, in the parable of the sower, talked about the seed that initially took root, but ultimately died because, the thorns and the thistles, he said that these are the cares of
cares of the
this world,
world. Hmm.
choked those things out. And, I think that is the reality that our church here in America that we find ourselves wrestling with. It's the cares of this life. And so, the prayer, I pray for myself, I pray for my children, I pray for my, local church that I am part of. I pray for the broader church in America that we would not allow ourselves to be blinded by our comforts, that
Yeah.
we would, allow those blessings that we've received, and utilize those well. It's, the enemy over and over again, he looks to corrupt, and it's so, you know ironic, if you will, that, blessings that Christ has bestowed upon us, rather than stewarding those, that, that the enemy would utilize those to drive a wedge
Yeah.
between ourselves
Mm.
and between God. That, that's how the enemy twists. That, even the blessings of God, that he'll try to twist those in ways that would pull us away, from our Father and from our fellow, brothers and sisters. So
Yeah.
that becomes my prayer, as far as, let us not be blind to those things.
Yeah, my former pastor used to say, I think others have said it, but Jesus came to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And I
Yeah.
think there's a level of we need to be made a little uncomfortable. And so, that's why I hope, just if you're hanging listening, I hope you feel a little uncomfortable with the fact that our brothers and sisters around the world are being persecuted and are suffering in so many other ways. And I hope that makes you want to do something, as we've outlined. Pray and then get involved. And, I don't care who it is. I do believe it needs to be a Christian organization, because we're not just meeting their physical needs, we're meeting their spiritual needs. We're sharing God's love in word and in deed. Do something. Do something. And Open Doors is one of those organizations that you can do something through, always here at Life Outreach International. But we're all on the same team. We're all serving the same Lord,
Absolutely.
and we have that same goal. And right now, people they will suffer if we don't take action. And that comes in all sorts of forms. So if you're watching, listening, pray about what God would have you do. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to uproot and sell everything and move to Africa somewhere. It may be starting with prayer, but it may be as simple as starting a campaign to hit your local representatives or senators. Or it may be just making a regular contribution to an organization. I like that, because the financial support is necessary. It is a necessary thing to get things done. But at the same time, I don't like that you can just give a little money and think you're done with it, because I think God calls us into a little more personal interaction and activity. So, but pray about it, and God will lead. Holy Spirit will lead you. That's what He's here for. Ryan, anything else you want to add? I sure appreciate the work you do and your time here today.
Oh, I thank you. It's always a privilege to be with you. I appreciate what you're doing, here through, obviously, the podcast, but as well as just ministry, throughout the U.S. and around the world. And so, thank you for allowing us to, come alongside and be part of that in a small way.
Absolutely. I mean, that if we can't care for our brothers and sisters around the world who are suffering, what good are we as a church? And I hate to put it that way, and I don't want to be harsh, but you know what? I hope you're watching and listening, and you're a little uncomfortable. And so make someone else a little uncomfortable by sharing this. And I say that with a little bit of a smile, but it should spur us to action. So hit that share button. If you haven't liked, follow, or subscribe Life Today TV, please do that. Check out opendoorsus.org and pray about what you should do. We can all do something. Let's do it. It will make a difference. We'll see you again next time here on Life Today Live.